Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over Game 5 of the 2014 World Chess Championship between Vishy Anand and Magnus Carlsen, the reigning champion. Just to give you a quick recap, Game 1 we had a draw. Game 2, Magnus Carlsen took the lead playing the white pieces. Vishy Anand came back playing the white pieces in Game 3 to even things up, and in Game 4 Magnus Carlsen drew with the white pieces. So we're in Game 5. Vishy Anand is going to be playing the white pieces. Magnus Carlsen is going to be playing the black pieces. As Vishy Anand usually does, he starts out with pawn to d4. Pretty interesting to see how Magnus Carlsen is going to respond. So far, he hasn't played very well when he's playing black against the pawn to d4. So he starts out with knight to f6. Pawn here to c4, and then pawn here to e6, kind of waiting to see where his opponent's going to go. Knight to c3 typically goes into the Nimzo Indian defense with bishop here to b4. A lot of players, when they start with pawn to d4, pawn to c4, when their opponents play this knight to f6, pawn to e6, opening up the door for the dark square bishop, they will first play knight to f3, and that's what Vishy Anand does, but this usually goes to a Queen's Indian defense, and so that's what Magnus Carlsen employs, and he plays pawn here to b6. Now, in the Queen's Indian defense, again, it's kind of hyper-modern defense where you're trying to control the center of the board with your minor pieces, and then later you start to push forward and counterattack with your pawns. White usually responds, as Vishy Anand does, by playing pawn here to g3, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop here on g2, and then for a lot of the game, there's going to be kind of this power struggle on the light squares. Both of these bishops are fianchetto on opposite sides, so they're both trying to control the center of the board, which is a very uncommon practice on the chessboard. You just don't see it very often. So definitely pretty exciting. One of the more aggressive defenses that black can have. So really interested to see how Magnus Carlsen comes out of the Queen's Indian defense and how Vishy Anand attacks it. Magnus responds with bishop here to b4 first, and then we see bishop here to d2. A little bit different again than the knight being here on c3, and then there could be an exchange, double pawns here on the c file. Vishy Anand doesn't have to deal with that, so bishop here to e7. Then we see the knight to c3, so things are okay now. Bishop here to b7, trying to control this long diagonal right here. We see bishop here to g2. Now, Magnus Carlsen has a few options, and what he's kind of learned in the past is Vishy Anand is very prepared for the World Championships. That may seem kind of obvious, but Magnus Carlsen even mentioned in the press conference, because they speak to these players after every match, that he was surprised by how prepared Vishy Anand was in this tournament so far as theoretical chess, going over kind of all the main lines and all the theories that go into all these deep openings and all the variations. Vishy Anand seemed to have studied more than he did the last time. So Magnus Carlsen kind of mentioned that he wanted to stay away from theoretical lines as much as possible because Vishy Anand may be more prepared than him, and he didn't want to give any advantage to his opponent. So with that said, he wanted to stay away from the more theoretical lines, the more common lines that Vishy Anand may have prepared for, those lines being castling on the king side, knight to c6. These are the more common lines. So Magnus Carlsen decided to try a little bit different variation. He played pawn here to c6, which allows him to kind of push forward with pawn here to d5 in the center, trying to control these light squares, and Vishy Anand took a little while to respond to this. It almost seemed like he was confused by Magnus Carlsen's play. He didn't want to fall for any traps that Magnus Carlsen may have employed on him. He ended up with going with pawn to e4, which I think is the correct way to attack this. It again is putting all of his pawns towards this light square. He also has his minor pieces on that as well. Magnus Carlsen pushes forward with pawn to d5, and then Vishy Anand just immediately plays pawn takes here on d5. So it looked like for just a split second he wanted to just make sure his mind was not playing tricks on him, that this was one of the lines that he had prepared for. And then when Magnus Carlsen did play that d5, he immediately played this. So it was kind of making sure that Magnus Carlsen knew that even this crazy line that you don't see very often, there hasn't been too much theory behind it, Vishy Anand was still ready. So Magnus Carlsen was going to have to try something else, or else Vishy Anand was going to be probably the more prepared person. We now see Magnus Carlsen take with his pawn. Anytime you're thinking about how to capture, you typically want to capture towards the center of the board. So if you kind of look at this, the pawn taking here on d5 from the E post, Magnus Carlsen now only has one central pawn, and it's going to be a little easier for Vishy Anand to attack this E file. Compare that to Magnus Carlsen taking right here. He has two central pawns. He has a very nice pawn chain right here, and it also opens up the door for his knight to come here to C6. So all in all, it's not always the case, but generally you want to be capturing towards the center of the board. Giving yourself more central pawns is always going to be better. So Magnus Carlsen takes with his C pawn, and then we see knight here to E5. We see castle, and then we see castle. We now see knight to c6, Magnus Carlsen continuing his development here. Vishy Anand taking on d5, adding more pressure on Magnus Carlsen. There's a few different ways that Magnus Carlsen can defend. He could take here on e5 if he wants to. He could take with his knight here on d5. He could recapture with his pawn here on d5. He decides to go and play knight taking here on e5. Vishy Anand has two main options. His first option, which he didn't choose, is the pawn taking here on e5, now kind of forcing the knight to recapture here on d5, and then the rook's going over here to c1, controlling this long file. That's one option. He chose a different route, which I think is a pretty good move. Vishy Anand plays pawn here to d6 with a discovered attack with his bishop on the square here on b7. It's attacking not only this light square bishop, the dark square bishop, and the knight here on e5, so putting a lot of pressure on his opponent. Magnus Carlsen, recognizing that one of those pieces is going to fall, decides he wants to hold on to his knight, so he plays knight to c6, and then Vishy Anand takes, and then the queen recaptures, and then the queen, this bishop comes up here to g5, allowing for the queen here on d1 to defend the square here on d4, and also attacking this knight and pinning it down to the queen. Pawn here to h6, forcing this bishop to move, but Vishy Anand has other plans. Instead of moving this bishop, first he decides to go and play pawn here to d5. Again, putting his opponent to the test, which is kind of what we've seen from the last game that Vishy Anand won with the white pieces. He was really the aggressor, and so that's kind of what he's doing right now. Pawn here to d5. Magnus Carlsen doesn't want to just take, pawn taking here on d5. Because the knight to d5, all of a sudden, this is a problem. The knight can't capture because it's being pinned down right here. All of a sudden, the queen is kind of forced to move. The queen may come here to e6, wants to make sure it's still holding on to this material right here, or else white would just be up in material. But now we just see the bishop take. The queen can't take again because it's being attacked by the knight, but if the pawn takes, then all of a sudden knight to c7, forking both the rook and the queen. So that's going to be bad. He doesn't like that option, so instead he decides to go ahead and play knight to a5. Now, he needs to be very careful. Magnus Carlsen, he can't bring his knights back here to b7. He can't bring it to c6. He can't bring it here to b3. His only square is c4. So if Vishy Anand can find a way to attack the square here on c4 and then play, pawn here to b4, all of a sudden Magnus Carlsen is going to be in a lot of trouble. So definitely Magnus Carlsen needs to make sure that later on he gets this knight involved into the game. Vishy Anand takes here on f6. Then we see the queen recapture. Doesn't want to take with his pawn. It just kind of opens up the door for his king to be attacked. Queen here to g4, threatening. After the king moves, he could continue with his attack. Queen to h4, forcing the king to come up here to h7. He could at any time just play pawn here to b4. Now that the queen, Vishy Anand, is attacking the square here on c4, this knight all of a sudden can't really go anywhere. And so this is definitely going to be not very good for Magnus Carlsen. And so he decides to go ahead and take with his queen on board. So now we see the pawn take here on e6. Vishy Anand just decided that he didn't want to have to deal with all of his pieces tied up trying to defend his isolated pawn here on the d file. So just gave it up. It would have been nice if he tried to push for maybe a promotion, maybe put more pressure on his opponent if he got his pawn up here to d7, but just didn't want to in the particular game. We now see the queen take here on e6, rook to e1, centralizing, attacking this queen. Queen back here to f6, knight to d5, pretty interesting move on board, and this kind of made Magnus Carlsen think for a while. This was a critical move in the game. A lot of the Grandmasters said this was a pretty nice initiative of Vishy Anand to try to play out for the win. So centralizing, Magnus Carlsen eventually decided to take with his bishop. He just wanted to get as much material off the board as possible. So this bishop's going to come up here, and then Magnus Carlsen plays rook to d8. Then we see the queen coming here to f3, defending this and attacking this queen. We see the queen come down here, capture material on b2. Then this rook's going to centralize. Vishy Anand just trying to control the center of the board. He can get the material back if he needs to. Magnus Carlsen really just wants to trade. He kind of forces with this move back here for Vishy Anand to trade. So we do see an exchange on the board. And from here, all sides kind of said that it's going to be very tough for Vishy Anand to play for a point without his queen. Now, if he could potentially get a passed pawn, maybe put a lot of pressure on his opponent, because he does have a bishop if there's two pawn chains on either side of the board, definitely has a lot more mobility than a knight. A knight usually does a lot better if there's just one pawn chain. So if all these pawns over here on the queen side were off and the knight was over here, it would be better than the bishop. But they said, okay, this bishop here on d5, it can swing all over the board, so maybe a slight advantage. But definitely after the queen comes off, it's definitely going to be very difficult for Anand. So looking for Magnus Carlsen to maybe make a mistake or try to find a passed pawn that he can maybe add more pressure to Magnus Carlsen. The rook up here to e7, always want to control the 7th rank of your opponent. King to g7, again, both the rook and the bishop here attacking this square right here. But right now, Magnus Carlsen has both his rook and his king defending it, but also wants to make sure that he is defending the other pawns right here, since he has doubled pawns on the f-file. We now see the rook swing over here to a7, gobble up this material. So Vishy Anand's equalized in material. He can start to add more pressure to his opponent. We now see knight to c6, and this, I thought, was another very interesting move in the game. Right now, Vishy Anand can definitely play for a point. It'd be a difficult point, but he has his pawn over here on a2. He can really try to hold on to this material, play rook to a4. This could definitely hold on to it. But in the game, Vishy Anand played rook here to b7. And this really is just kind of saying, let's just move on to the next game. Let's just exchange off all material, play for a draw. Magnus Carlsen plays knight to b4, and we see some exchanging off the board, and then the knight taking here on a2, and all of a sudden, Vishy Anand doesn't have the pawn over here on the a-file. All of a sudden, Magnus Carlsen now has the better minor piece, since there's one set of pawn chains over here on the king side, and so it's going to be very difficult for either player to find an end game where they can get a full point. So the knight's going to start swinging over here to the king side. Both sides, at this point, they were almost playing blitz chess. This is all in-game theory that both sides have kind of mastered right here. We do see an exchange off the board, and right now, very, very drawish in-game. There's no way for either side to have a real advantage. So they just kind of went through a few moves just to see if anyone was going to make a mistake. And then all of a sudden, we see after the 39th move, it only took 2.5 hours. So definitely a short game. We never hit time control for either player, so they were kind of going through this pretty fast. But this situation, they decided to draw. So I was a little disappointed. Vishy Anand came out the gates, played extremely well. Magnus Carlsen a few times kind of put Vishy Anand to the test. He tried to be pretty aggressive, but then at the end, it almost seemed like he lost steam. Maybe not sure if he was prepared for some of the variations Magnus Carlsen put him into, but definitely at the end didn't go with some of the more aggressive lines that he could have. Maybe he just thought Magnus Carlsen's end game was better, so decided to just go ahead and accept the draw and move on. So tomorrow, Magnus Carlsen will come back for Game 6 with the white pieces and try to, for the first half, again, there's 12 games, so try to come out of the first half with a win. But so far, pretty exciting stuff from the Chess World Championship. Hopefully you guys are enjoying the commentary, you're learning stuff, and watching these two great players play. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.